So yeah, I'm really glad to have you here, Ali, and Dr. Kubler. Thank you so much for being here too. And we're going to share this with the wider community. But this week we're scheduled to talk about thought experiments in ethics. And I shared with you a little podcast, which is kind of quirky if you listen to it. It's about 50 minutes long on the trolley problem, but it's not really on the trolley problem. It's kind of about like what ethics is. And the podcaster did this really kind of endearing, I've never thought about ethics a single moment in my life kind of spiel. And anticipated that what they would talk about in the podcast was the meme. So I'm sure, Ali, you've seen social media and other places the meme of the trolley problem. Is that a concept or a case that's familiar to you?
Yes, definitely.
So where do you know it from?
I see it on like Instagram and all Facebook pages.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I don't know if you watched, it was a couple of years ago now, but The Good Life, the TV show that came out.
Oh,
Uh,
I've heard of that.
yeah, so the writer of The Good Life, whose book I've got kicking around here somewhere, um, the writer of The Good Life was really into sort of philosophy and sort of ethics case studies and used these to build up this story. And so the trolley problem plays a really prominent role. So it shows up all over social media. And this podcast was really kind of nice because it was the podcaster who was thinking about the memes and his interviewee, who was a philosopher, who was like, I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about the trolley problem. And he really kind of went into it. And I like that very much. And that's kind of, it was a good indication of what we tend to do in these sessions. So Ali, let me pick on you for a second. What do you know about the trolley problem? Like, what is it to you when you think about it?
Honestly, I really don't know anything about it.
Right on, right on. Yeah,
But
so it's a
yeah.
really famous thought experiment, and that's what we're talking about. That's what I wanted to talk with you all about today. Is like, what's the point of thought experiments in ethics or in philosophy? How are they different than case studies? Are they useful or not? And so maybe, and Dr. Kubler, you've heard me talk on this before, but maybe Ali, for your sake, I'll just tell you a little history of the trolley problem, and then I can give you some other examples. And I bet, Dr. Kubler, you've got some as well, thought experiments. But the trolley problem is a pretty old thought experiment in ethics. And it actually was first developed or coined back in the mid 1960s by Philippa Foot, an ethicist, bioethicist, who was writing in the abortion debate. So early in the abortion debate. And she was interested in what philosophers call the doctrine of double effect, which we'll just bracket and set aside for now. But she developed this case of the trolley problem. And it was a traditional model. It was, the story goes, you have the capacity to shift a trolley car from one track to another. If you let it go, it's going to mow down, it's going to kill one person who's tied to the tracks for some reason that we don't have to worry about, right? They're stuck on the tracks. But if you pull the lever, you're going to send the trolley down another track. But on that track, there are 5 people stuck on the track, and the trolley's going to kill all 5. And the question is, what do you do? And there's really interesting, I mean, you run this with friends or family and you ask them the scenario and you get all kinds of different answers, and more interestingly, different reasons for those answers. And the trolley problem has sort of exploded. So in 1967, Philippa Foot built this case to show that that negative duties, so refraining from harm, carries more weight in moral decisions than positive duties or obligations to do good. So she thinks you should have the trolley kill the one guy, not the 5 guys, because you've got 2 competing negative duties, right? They're both stuck on the tracks. The harm is coming to both of them. So you prevent the most harm you can. You pull the lever, squish the one guy, but you save the 5 people. So in some sense, there's like a calculation going on, right? You're preventing more harm than in the one case than the other case. And so that's the right decision. But it's not that easy, of course. So then a decade later or so, in the mid 70s, Judith Jarvis Thomson, same debate, abortion debate, another philosopher, she tweaked this case and she said, yeah, we get it. You put 2 negative duties up against each other, the 5 people or the 1 people, and I can get that reasoning, but let's tweak the thought experiment. So she reimagines the case. And so now, instead of a trolley coming down 2 tracks, you've got the same sort of thing happening, but you could stop the trolley from crushing the 5 people by pushing a fat person off a bridge. It's a very 1960s, 1970s case. So it's endearingly and problematically called Fat Man on the Bridge in the literatures, but you basically push somebody off a bridge onto the track. And what you're doing there is preventing the harm to the 5 people. And Foote and Thompson says, see, Philippa Foote, with that thought experiment, I think you're wrong, right? Because it feels really not good to actively push somebody off a bridge to save 5 people. So what what Judith Jarvis Thompson has done is set up a positive duty against a negative duty, right? 5 people are going to die, but you have an obligation to do good. And if you actively push somebody off the bridge, then you're setting up the entirely different debate. And there's all kinds of nuance there. There's all kinds of details around the trolley problem, a million different examples, but it's really famous because it's one of these thought experiments. So what's a thought experiment? Well, I guess it's a constraint. It's like an imagining. You put constraints on an artificial world to make a case, to make an argument, and let people think through the implications. Now, Ali, these might be new to you. So I was going to ask, like, have you heard of any other thought experiments in philosophy?
What you just said, I've actually heard about. So
Yeah.
that was a great refresher on what that was.
Cool. Yeah, there's a million of these. And Dr. Kubler, I might ask you, you probably know a bunch from the scientific world. Or I could mention some and you might be able to explicate them more clearly than I can. But I was thinking of Maxwell's demon. Do you know this case? Oh, you're muted.
I've heard about it, and I think you're probably the better explainer. And you've also told some, like Astrid the astronaut, that I really like. And kind of not that we have to answer the question immediately, but just as you're talking, things I'm thinking is how powerful the thought experiment is for maybe focusing on the values that are involved and pushing away all the extraneous obfuscating ideas associated with real world problems. So there's this tension because maybe it's not the real world, but what it does is it lets you focus on the values so that you can then maybe get back to the real world. And I think that's intriguing because it's so much like science. If you want to model a spaceship traveling up into space, the first thing you do is think about a mass, which is a dot. You think about gravity, which is a vector pulling it down, and it gets so abstracted. But we need to have that level of abstraction to start to get to the first level of understanding of what's going to happen to that rocket when we have millions of pounds of burning hydrogen and oxygen thrusting out the bottom. So it just strikes me that there's such a cool parallel between how people think in philosophy and the humanities and how we think in the sciences. And that's another place where we draw a barrier, and yet they're so homogeneous in many ways. So I love this topic.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I'm part of my big driving worry in this session was just that. So in science, we do this all the time. We go from the abstract to the practical, and we figured out how to do that. We know it works because we've landed things on the moon and on Mars, and like we're good at science and technology. The question is, does the abstraction in, say, ethics work the same way? Is it easy enough to go from the abstract to the practical? The abortion debate, Ali, if this is something you're into, the abortion debate is really intriguing because these early scholars in the 60s and 70s set up this distinction between killing and letting die. And this is the negative and positive duties thing. And that has been an ongoing debate, an ongoing framing, I guess, of the abortion debate since that time. And it's not like we've solved that debate, right? It's still an ongoing struggle, but that lens, that like specificity of looking at a particular problem is really powerful. And it happens in science. So I can try to relay the Maxwell's demon case, but this is maybe a bit beyond me. And Ali, if you know this, if you come from the STEM worlds at all and you know equilibrium theory, then you can help us too. But this was like 1860 something. This is an old story now. But the story was trying to figure out equilibrium in systems and the problem of entropy. And so as I understand it, you could imagine, the thought experiment is, you can imagine a box, 2 chambers. On the one side, you've got fast-moving warm particles, and on the other side, you've got slow-moving cold particles. And if you open a little trap door in the flap between these 2 chambers, eventually the system is going to reach equilibrium, right? Fast particles are going to move in one direction, cold particles are going to move in another, and eventually the system will reach a state of, will entropy to a state of equilibrium. So you get a lukewarm box, basically. And Maxwell came up with this thought experiment. He said, well, just imagine, instead of like an arbitrary flow of particles towards equilibrium, that you had a little demon, like a little monster or something, that artificial monster, right, that's sitting in this box. And what he's doing is opening a massless door really fast. So he sees a hot particle coming, and he's like, zoop, and the hot particle goes through, and he closes the door. So no cold particles get through. And he does this over and over. And so he's allowing warm particles in, but not cold particles. And so there's no work being done, no energy entering the system. And this is where my physics knowledge gets a little slippery, but this would then violate the second law of thermodynamics, right? And Maxwell apparently, again, out of my wheelhouse, but apparently this thought experiment is still being considered and played with in physics to try to understand the nature of entropy and the role of external power and forces that play in it.
Yeah, I remember it too from a prior discussion. I think I've seen it. I don't have an answer for it, that's for sure. Glad that you say it's something that physicists are still pondering. Again, I think it's interesting in that it throws away a lot of extraneous detail to let you focus on the underlying issue of, what does it really mean to say there's disorder or order in a system? It's not practical, because this idea of the demon, of course, is one of the craziest parts right on the front of it. And the idea of a mapless door that you can open and close infinitely fast. Okay, that's going to violate some law out there, right? But it lets you say, if you could, then what? And what does that say about the existing theory? And it lets you ask the question, does the theory and all the observables that we have exist simply because of those foundational principles of whether the particle can be stopped from transiting through the hole, or is it more subtle than that? Is it fundamentally because we can't make that massless door? So it lets us start thinking through what we mean by the abstractions that we develop and apply to the problem. So yeah, I don't have the answer for that one, but I think it's similar in that it really makes you think deeply about physics that you might take for granted, much the same way that the trolley problem makes you think a little more deeply about assumptions that you might take for granted, like saving 5 to kill 1 is obviously justified. It makes you go deeper and say, well, what if we knew something more about those individuals and their quality of life, or their age, or their potential, or how do we ascribe value to persons? Is it just because of numbers of individuals, or maybe their potentials? And I've seen nuances to the trolley problem that start to ask those questions, and that changes how people vote or think. So I think it pushes away the nuance and lets you think about your values, and then you can fold that back in and gain better understanding of what your thinking actually is. Whether it's Maxwell and his demon and thermodynamics, or whether it's the values of life.
Yeah, and I'm unsure of myself here, because I feel a tension between scientific thought experiments and ethics thought experiments in this sense, right? So Maxwell's demon, and then my other example, the other go-to example is Schrodinger's cat, which we can talk through. But here's an example from quantum mechanics, which is again kind of hypothetical, abstract, but it's supposed to get us to question the theory. But those thought experiments, as I understand them, are meant to sort of set the stage for future empirical research, right? The what ifs can be explored empirically if we have the right equipment or the right framing, and then you could get an answer, right? There's a story to tell about why Schrodinger's cat is a problem. Allie, not the real cat, but the hypothetical cat. That one you might know.
Yes, I gotcha.
Yeah. She's with us. Yeah. So Schrodinger's cat does that same work. But then the moral philosophy thought experiments feel a little different to me, because they're sort of saying, what reasons do you have for moral judgment or moral evaluation? And it's not as if any answer to that thought experiment can be empirically tested in the same way. I mean, we can kind of empirically test in the sense that we can take surveys of people and whatever, but the ethics work feels different to me, and is often asserted as different by our colleagues in STEM and our colleagues who outside of ethics specifically. But,
what do you think, Allie? Do you think they're very different? Tell us what field you're in. Just generally, you could be a scientist or someone in the humanities, whatever. But tell us your perspective. And do you think these kinds of two thought experiments sound very different from your perspective?
So I'm an integrated business major, but
Cool.
I do appreciate science and all the humanities stuff. And it definitely to me sounds very complex, and it's I think it's really cool though. I really, yeah, it's really cool to me.
Yeah, and
And
you're in an area where there's a whole field of ethics. I don't know much
oh
about it. I
yeah,
think Dr. Beaver does, but there's a whole field of business ethics. And then there's connections even to valuation of life. We think about one important business, the insurance industry, and the idea of risk and harm. The idea of counting and valuing human life comes into play, right? That's a big part of many types of business. So you have your own ethics sub-discipline within your field, and probably also a myriad of thought experiments that may go behind it as well.
definitely, definitely. That's about all that I have about it.
Yeah, I'm
Hi,
trying to I'm
Sterling.
trying to think if I can remember any or think of any thought experiments specific to business ethics. I think a lot of them have been applied in that direction, but I think
Yeah,
we could even imagine that work, right? So we can try that in just a second. But Sterling, welcome. Thanks for being here. We're talking thought experiments in ethics today. So if you've got any to share with us, let me know.
Do you have any examples?
Yeah,
Because there's a whole lot in behavioral economics.
yeah. So
Yeah.
this would be interesting, I think, to Ali coming from the business world. But yeah, we started with the podcast focused on the trolley problem, very famous. We talked a little
Yeah.
bit about ethics thought experiments versus physics or ontology thought experiments like Maxwell's demon and Schrodinger's cat, which you might know. And then I've got a whole list of other thought experiments in ethics we could talk through. But from behavioral economics, what are you thinking of? What's your
Well, one that comes to mind right away was, and I think it was spoken about by Arelli rather than Kahneman, but they presented students, and it might have been MIT, but anyway, they presented students ahead of class, ahead of a test. They said, okay, this group of students, just think about, and it doesn't have to be Christian ethics, but just think about the 10 Commandments. Just try to remember as many commandments as you can. And the other group, they set aside and said, try to remember as many books as you've read, period. Okay. And they let them loose. They gave them the test. The students that had tried to think of the 10 Commandments completely avoided cheating altogether. And the students that were tasked with remembering the books they read cheated at somewhere, I feel like it was 7 to 11% or something on the testing. Yeah. So does that qualify as that type of, is what you're talking about?
yeah, this is so interesting, right? So this was the other thing I wanted to do in the session is try to think about what exactly thought experiments, like what are the necessary conditions for thought experiments? Because what you're describing to me is I would describe back to you as an experiment in experimental philosophy or in moral psychology, right? We're trying to think about how can we set up a design of an experiment to get at people's reactions to a particular scenario. And there's a ton of these, right? There's the famous moral psychology example of, and I think Sterling, you've described this to me, but the thought experiment of setting up people walking to a business meeting and then somebody dropping a laptop outside, and depending on what conditions you set, like what conditions you set for the person who thinks they're late for the meeting, they will stop
Right.
and help or they won't stop and help, right?
I remember that vaguely. Right.
And these I think would be familiar to Ali too in the business world, that a lot of these sort of experimental psychological behavioral, you describe them as behavioral economics. They're not thought experiments necessarily as straight experiments, right? We're looking at human behavior, human perception, human response to stressors, those kinds of things. Thought experiments, in my mind at least, thought experiments are the necessary condition is that they're artificial, right? Anyone that I can think of, they're abstracted from reality, and they're put really tight constraints on them. Right, so we're not worrying about external factors. They're like they're like abstract imaginings of experiments where you have complete control over any variable you want at any time. And then the power of the thought experiment is that you can, without doing empirical work, change any variable you want at any time in any scenario.
So as you've come to that and raised that question of, what's the difference between a practical applied experiment versus a thought experiment? I'm not sure what the opposite of a thought experiment is. At first I was thinking the thought experiment is pure constraint, pure thought. It's independent of so many experiential parameters. But then I quickly changed my mind. First of all, something like the Maxwell's demon thought experiment you presented is quite abstracted, and it doesn't really require tremendous experience. None of us can think about being a subatomic demon that can quickly open a massless door, or what that really means. Although we have the experiential notion of trying to move through a door that may be closing, behind us, and how you'd have to be going fast if the door is closing fast. So in some ways, it leverages the human experience of transiting through a door in order to conceive it, right? But beyond that, it stays in a very abstracted realm. So I think in some ways the thought experiments necessarily are connected and grounded to some level of human experience. But it's more than that, because I still think that even with the thought experiments, the outcome really depends upon the level of human connection. Because back to the trolley problem, if you just say, do you pull the lever in order to save 5 lives at the expense of 1? It's a numbers game. But if you add nuance to it, and I would argue make a tighter connection to human experience, you get a different outcome. Because if you say, for instance, that the person tied on the track is a close relative, right? Now you are tugging at heartstrings. You are connecting to someone's human experience of empathy, and it causes people to pause about whether they would pull the lever or not. Or if you say, the 5 on the trolley are elderly, terminally ill, the 1 person on the track is in the beginning or prime of their life, very intelligent with much to contribute to society, then if that person is leveraging from their own experience a valuation for, say, knowledge and the person's potential longevity and creative capacity, then it will change their outcome and whether to pull the lever or not. So although it's an abstracted problem, it's not divorced from human experience. And in some ways, maybe it's more susceptible in its outcome to what a person's human experience is or how you phrase the problem.
Yeah, 100%. And in that sense, I think thought experiments are very much like scientific experiments, in that depending on how you design them, they're meant to sort of pump or test our intuitions. So that's the trick. When you take the trolley problem and you start giving identities to the people on the tracks, if you do it carefully, you've got 5 arbitrary nondescript persons and Hitler. That's the one my students always go to, right? Who are you going to go after, right? Who are you going to let the trolley squish? And everybody's like, oh, Hitler, of course. And then you sort of say, well, why? And it's all about priming. You've set a constraint there, and you've tested that intuition. What are our intuitions about Hitler? Astrid and the astronaut, the one that I love so much, that thought experiment does the same thing. Our intuitions about the value of non-humans, cats in this case. In fact, Schrodinger's cat is a great example of this, to cross that bridge. So, Allie, did you say you know Schrodinger's cat as a thought experiment?
Yes, I've heard about it. Yeah.
Okay, bear with me. I'm gonna play this out for you, right?
Yes.
So imagine you've got a cat, and somebody takes the cat, like a magician, takes the cat and turns away from you, does something to the cat, puts it in a box, locks the box, and turns back around with the box and says, Allie, is this cat alive or dead? How would you know if the cat is alive or dead?
Right. Maybe if I heard like noises from inside the box, I could tell if it's alive.
Okay, cool. That's a great answer. Yeah. So let me put a further constraint on the thought experiment. Let's say the box is sound and vibration proof. You can't hear or feel anything going on in the box. How would you know if the cat's alive or dead?
I definitely would not know.
Okay, but then the magician hands you the box. How would you determine if it's alive or dead?
Opening the box.
Totally, 100%, right? This is not, it's not a trick question, right? And that for me has been the power of Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, because the reason Schrodinger's cat exists is because this physicist, Alfred Schrodinger, is that right? I can't remember. He wanted to better understand, better describe to his colleagues and to the general public the problem of the two-slit experiment in physics. This one I know well enough to describe, right? The idea in early quantum mechanics is a light beam, a particle, or a wave. And they were trying to set up an experiment to determine this. And they came up with this really interesting and now classic experiment. You send a light at a board, and it's got two slits in it. And then what you're going to measure is how many times particles or the beam passes through and hits the back of this board through the two slits. And it turns out it hits in patterns. And the only way to describe the result of this experiment is that the particle, that the nature of light is not a beam or a particle, but it's kind of a indeterminate mix of both. And the only way you can determine is by looking. And this is the power of observation in quantum mechanics. And to go from that abstract thing about light and particles and waves to cat in a box, I think lets people say, oh, I know cats and I know boxes. And if you told me this like magician story I just told Ali, I'd know how to check if the cat were alive or dead. I'd look. And Schrodinger would say, precisely, right? Looking is exactly how we determine the nature of light, right? Particles or beams. And so what he's done is encapsulated this completely abstract and at that time kind of revolutionary problem of the indeterminacy of energy into this one story about a cat in a box. And everybody now knows cats and boxes, and they can sort of understand what's happening. And then they say, well, wait, that is really weird. And Schrodinger would say, yes, that's why we need to study it more, right? So it's in that sense, it's kind of a pump or a refuter, right? To take a classic position and critique it, or to take an assumption that we might have and adjust it. And so Schrodinger's cat does this. Maxwell's demon is supposed to do this, more or less. And there's lots of other classic examples around what I'm going to set in an ontology bucket, right? What's the nature of the world kind of bucket over here. And those are all the physics experiments, the ones from business, the behavioral economics one, Sterling. I see a man on your screen, Sterling.
So I just throw in a little monkey wrench here. That's the Little Prince. I have a whole altar dedicated to Little Prince.
Okay.
He didn't care, but remember what he did with the sheep. He wanted the sheep drawn. He wanted the pilot to draw him a sheep. And all he did was, the perfect sheep was a box with holes in it to breathe. That was the perfect drawing of a sheep.
Nice. I've forgotten about that story. Yeah.
So I'm sorry to.
No,
so
no.
that kind of, that messed up the visual completely of trying to see if the sheep was. I don't know. I just, well, you know how things come in and out of stratosphere of my mind.
It's really good. I mean, that's why I like these conversations so much, because I think what we're connecting to there, Sterling, is that there's this power of story and narrative and visual that sort of connects us to these big philosophical questions. And that happens all through moral psychology too. We could run a million more of these if you're interested, but there's the last person experiment from Richard Routley or Richard Sylvan back in the 70s about environmental ethics. That's a famous one. There's the liar at the door paradox from Immanuel Kant. There's the experience machine by Richard Nozick. There's Plato and the Ring of Gyges. I mean, there's there's bunches of these. Whole books have been written about them. And each one is supposed to direct us towards a very specific problem or issue in ethics and give us a lens to look at it. Sort of a strategy by which to better understand it. And again, I like the story. I like the narrative. We can build all these connections, and then we start like working on the variables and tweaking them, and they do all these different work for us. But my original questions are still sort of, what are the goal of thought experiments? And are they useful in any way? Right?
I wonder if, I was just gonna say, I wonder if one of the distinctions is the following. I would think of practical experiments, maybe scientific experiments where you're measuring something. They're fundamentally focused on understanding the universe, right? But also getting an answer to that specific problem. So through the process of trying to get an answer for that problem, you learn something about the universe. I'm wondering if you're leading us to the notion, among others, that the point of the thought experiment is not to answer the question of the experiment, but to leverage all that human experience and how that experience and nuance added to the problem changes the way you think of it, not to get us to answer the question, but to understand how we're posing the very questions and you know what our values are. So it's not so much about answering, do I pull the lever or not, but really understanding how all of the human perceptions on the problem, especially when you tweak it and change it or ask different people about the problem, are really revealing how we assess and value real world problems. Is it that or similar?
I think so. So if I'm following you're asking about whether thought experiments are supposed to direct us towards practical answers or not. Like
well, that when you put out the trolley problem, for example, the person who poses that question is not fundamentally that interested in how many people really want to pull the lever or not. They're more interested in what we're thinking about why you pull or don't pull the lever, and then how that informs real world values or real world problems.
Yeah.
Because you talked about posing the problem and then tweaking it or modifying it and seeing how our responses change and what that reveals. So it made me think really the goal of the thought experiment is the revelation that comes in the tweaking, not so much the answer from the original problem or any of its variants.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think I was hesitating because I feel like my answer is in the middle. When I think about the trolley problem, it is the case that, say, Philippa Foot in the first introduction of this case wanted to use what she assumed would be our intuitions about a scenario to advocate, to argue for a position in the abortion debate. And then Judith Jarvis Thompson said, yeah, that worked, but what if we tweak the thought experiment? And then we've got sort of contradictory intuitions. And so now you're in a position where you've got two arguments you've got to evaluate. Like, it can't just be that Foot was right, but now we've got Thompson's counter. And so they were using thought experiments as argumentative strategies. So they were relying on actually what people's intuitions are, so what people actually would respond to in order to make a case for a particular position. So it feels like it's a bit of a both and, right? Especially in the case of what some people have called intuition pumps as thought experiments. The idea that we're designing a thought experiment to prime our intuition and then knock it down or adjust it or counter it or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit of the both end, I guess.
What's a newer thought experiment that you've heard about? I mean, you know, there's hundreds out there. Is there a new thought experiment that maybe none of us have been exposed to, that pops into your mind, and maybe how it's useful for some of those, some of that intuition pumping or real world issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. It strikes me that there was kind of an era of thought experiments that all came out around the same time. And maybe there's just too much literature at this point, but I can't think of any one that really stands out in the contemporary world. A lot of them are not so tightly constrained. So a lot of science fiction is supposed to be doing this, sort of priming us to think about, say, artificial agents in a particular way.
Right. Okay, well, then I have a different question. Maybe something will come to you. But here's a different question. I'm aware from a famous UCF colleague and philosopher, Bruce Jantz, who's got a great webpage on kind of history of science and traditions. He talks about the emergence of the Western tradition in science and how, I'm not going to get all of this correct, but how pure theory is maybe more of the French tradition, and empiricism tends to be more on an English tradition. And then there's kind of an evolution in time that leads us maybe to the modern approach to science and such. I guess one of the takeaways that I had is that the way science has evolved, or the way contemporary scientists of the period were thinking about science, was very much rooted in culture. And their approaches, whether they embraced abstraction or whether they embrace empirical measurement. And I just wonder, is the thought experiment in philosophy in any way attached to culture or history in such a way that it's more accessible for some types of thinkers in either a period or with a cultural reference? Or do you find as a philosopher, thought experiments that come from Asian philosophy, from African philosophy, that it's common to human experience, or is it much more tightly connected to culture?
Oh yeah, that's such an interesting question. I am ill-equipped to answer it because
Okay.
I have to imagine there are examples in, say, Eastern philosophy, Asian philosophy, in African philosophy, in Native American philosophy that would fill some of the requirements of thought experiments as I'm thinking of them. But in those traditions, at least the things that I'm thinking of are more like stories, like cosmological narratives, like stories about the nature of the world from the perspective of spirits and gods and the creation and like all of the sort of spiritual infrastructure that comes with a lot of those traditions. And when I think of thought experiments, at least, they do seem to be constrained by specific time period and specific philosophical traditions. So what we define as analytic traditions, and this might make sense because what a lot of analytic philosophy tried to do is mirror what was happening in science, right? So the positivist turn, the experimental turn. So all of these things were happening at the same time. So in the 1960s through the 1980s or 90s, there were a whole series of these thought experiments, but they all came out from kind of one type of philosopher. The narrative-driven continental philosophers that Dr. Jans was talking about tend to work in experience and narrative and story as well. So they're probably less likely to develop these abstract thought experiments. I'm going through a longer list I've got of thought experiments that I was working on with a graduate student who's doing her dissertation in this work down at USF. And that list is almost all ethics and almost all analytic philosophy. And almost all that same thought, that same time period. Astrid the Astronaut, the Carruthers story that I tell a lot is a mid-90s, early 90s story. So that's relatively
that's more recent.
Yeah. And then, of course, a lot of these classic stories have been re-upped. So the trolley problem became Cheaty's Trolley in The Good Place just back in 2014 or 15.
Right.
Sterling, I see your hand and I missed. Yeah, go ahead, please. I missed your chat.
So really interesting with some of I'm listening to Dr. Kubler's verbiage because he talks about experience. And then he was also talking about intercultural. So that brought my mind to Kahneman's behavioral economics discussion of memory versus experience. And experiences are fleeting. They don't necessarily make it to our memory. And he has a great YouTube video that's like 17 minutes long, and he describes, talks about all that sort of thing. But it's also economical. We spend, as Americans, a certain amount of money to achieve memories, not experiences. And there's a cutoff at I don't remember what income he mentioned, but there's an actual cutoff in your yearly, in a salary, in this person's salary as to where they pay or invest in memories versus experiences. So it kind of, hearing Dr. Kubler mention our reactions to these thought experiments based on our experiences, but what experiences are we maintaining as memories? Does that make any sense? I mean, it probably clouds things, makes things worse, but and that's more of the, like I said, that's in the behavioral economics realm. And then, of course, probably the base of behavioral economics is rationality. We are not rational as economics. Economics in the 80s and the studies of that was rationality. And Peter Uber up at I believe he's at Duke University. He's involved in this sort of stuff too. He says, thank God we are not rational. Humans are not rational because we'd be at each other's throats all the time. So compassion and everything is not necessarily the rational.
So maybe Sterling, you're describing another constraint when we're trying to define what thought experiments are.
Right.
It could be the case that, and maybe this strikes me as true, that behavioral economics has paralleled the sort of moral psychology shift in ethics from rationalism to behavior, I guess, or irrationalism, I guess. And thought experiments, as I've described them, all the ones I can think of anyway, are necessarily reasoning strategies, right? They're not behavioral shifts. They're not trying to get us to do anything different. They're trying to get us to reason through constraints towards some or another output. So they're sort of by necessity reason thought experiments. So that would make sense why behavioral economicists, is that a thing? Sure, are not doing thought experiments, right? If they're sort of saying rationality, smashinality, and moving towards behavior in the same way that the moral psychologists are poking, then they're going to leave thought experiments behind. Maybe for the reason, I don't know Kathleen Wilkes, but Sterling, you said in the chat, I'll read this to Ali and others. Kathleen Wilkes is one philosopher who holds that there's no need to use far-fetched improbable thought experiments when theorizing about personal identity, since there are real-life situations to draw from, and those situations allow us to draw reliable conclusions. So the idea here is very much experimental. It's very much behavior-driven. It's very much practical, right? That the point of any of our theorizing is to do things in the world. And so the best you could do is make those as realistic as possible. Whereas I think in the circling back now to its origin, right? Thought experiments and the trolley problem, the point of drawing those thought experiments is that the abortion debate had reached sort of a fever pitch about, as it has again, contemporary world, between these two competing positions. And Foote was trying to say, okay, yeah, there's a lot of emotion here, but if we step back and think of the underlying principles, maybe we can get to a place where we can reason together towards outcomes. And so she was trying to build a rational argument that maybe would lead to policy. Yeah, go ahead, Sterling.
Well, I was just going to say, I really like Dr. Kubler's intuitions about whether the person is a relative or anything, because that, one of the behavioral economics basis is loss, and how much more we value not losing over winning. And he's referring to, a loss of someone in the family or someone versus ageism and things like that. So I don't know if if some of the aspects of the behavioral economics can be pushed aside in these thought experiments at all.
Right, and maybe they can't. So another parallel question is, if we're worried about the place and the role of thought experiments, what do they complement, or what do they need to go alongside with necessarily in order to be usable, right?
Just to add my own confusion and obfuscation to this, a few minutes back, you used the word story when you were talking about thought experiments and how they function. And I, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the role of the morality play in history, and also the role which becomes modern theater. Yep. And also the role of the Greek tragedy. And I don't think they're all trying to do the same thing, but functionally they cause us to look inward and reflect on morality and our ethics. The morality play, was trying to push a certain type of ethic or bring a population to agree with a set of mores. The Greek tragedy in some ways was trying to set up an ethical conflict, right, or a conflict of values, and show the flawed character, often the hero, in a rock and a hard place where there was no positive outcome, right, and yet within that it puts the viewer in the position of saying, my gosh, what did they do? Why did they do that? What would I do? Why was it right or wrong? And so it has you looking inward. And I think the maybe the thought experiment in some way does that as well by having you question values or think about your values or think about what your values are that you're bearing on the problem, especially when you add nuance and you change it a little bit, and then you find yourself capitulating, to a new set of outcomes, right? And changing your viewpoints. You then are forced to look inward and think about how your values are affecting the problem. The difference maybe is the morality. The thought experiment puts you in the driver's seat and asks you overtly, what would you do? Whereas, these other forms that cause you to reflect on ethics, they are setting you up as an observer and maybe leading you to a conclusion of one form or the other. They're all forms of storytelling, to your point, or that sort of slipped out. And so I just wanted to throw that out because that was a parallel that I saw.
Oh, that's super interesting. There's the voice of Plato from like first year ethics pestering me in the back of my head now, because Plato would say, well, the difference, Dr. Kubler, of course, is that one is sophistry, one is rhetoric. It's telling you emotionally laden stories to get you to believe X and Y, but giving you no reason to do so. Whereas thought experiments, they're trying to set up conditions to let you, rational animal, reason through to a specific outcome. So everything we've talked about, right? These tensions between rationality and emotion, logos and eros, all of these bits of us that drive, set up these tensions. And we don't even have to go, that thread of the moral fable kind of goes through the morality plays, through fables and literature, through He-Man and G.I. Joe in the 1980s that we grew up with, each of which had like they were moral stories, right? Just in these sort of contemporary genres, all trying to do the same thing to get us to say, oh, this is an exemplar of what's good and what's right, and this is what's bad and what's evil, trying to set that up for us. But again, through artistic and the pejorative ways, right? Emotional appeals, what Plato would call sophistry. And I think that's super interesting because that's what a lot of science fiction has done too. The contemporary superhero universes and pick a science fiction film, they're all trying to do that same thing, tell you a story about a more or less nuanced story about the battle between right and wrong and good and bad and whatever. Yeah. So the place of thought experiments are supposed to, I think another way to read it is that they're supposed to emphasize our individual rational capacities to think about these conditions and reason to an end strategy without the emotional appeals. But not all of them do that. I mean, Astrid the Astronaut's a great example of a case where there's a direct appeal to intuition. And without that intuition, the thought experiment really doesn't go, or it goes differently. Yeah.
When I hear them, I inherently feel discomfort. As a human, I'm forced to wrestle with the unease of lack of clarity. Right? We all want to know the answer, or what should I do, or sometimes what I did was right, or the way I'm thinking is right. But I think the magic in some ways of the thought experiment is that they set up constraints where it's not obvious what the answer is, and it forces us to confront the discomfort, often resulting from competing values. And I wonder if that's a big element of the thought experiment, that it forces you to wrestle with that unease, and out of that comes a sense of appreciation outside of the self.
Yeah, that makes sense. Not only is it forcing you to reason, but it's putting you in a position where the reasoning matters to you, right? The outcome directs you in a moral sense. Yeah. There's a series.
You should tell Astrid.
I should tell Astrid. Sterling, you've heard Astrid. Before, yeah.
There's so many cool topics, but if we run out, you should share Astrid, because I think it's so much fun.
Okay, yeah, I can tell Astrid. Ali, have you taken any philosophy courses where you might have heard this story before?
I have not heard that story, but I have taken a few other type of classes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead in our last few minutes. I'll tell this story and just give you a sense. Maybe we can then think about what that thought experiment does as opposed to some of the others. So this one is from, I think if I remember right, 1993, Peter Carruthers wrote this book, The Animals Issue. So this is animal ethics. And the thought experiment he designs is called Astrid the Astronaut. So imagine there's an astronaut, Astrid. she's headed on a one-way trip away from Earth, never to see another human being ever again. And on this trip away from Earth, never to see another human being ever again, she thinks she's going to get bored. And so to alleviate her boredom, she brings with her 3 darts and a cardboard cutout of a cat. So on this trip away from Earth, never to see another human being ever again, Astrid does in fact get bored. And so to alleviate her boredom successfully, she throws the darts at the cardboard cutout. Is Astrid doing anything ethically wrong? Allie, what do you think? Is Astrid doing anything ethically wrong in this case?
I could see it both ways.
Oh, good.
I
Okay.
can see
Okay.
where since she's throwing the darts at a cardboard cat, you would think possibly unethical because it could be at a cat, an actual cat. She wouldn't care if she actually did it in real life.
Okay.
But then it's just cardboard. That's also the other thing.
Right on, right on. Okay, so I iterated. Part of the constraint on this thought experiment is really important. So I iterated that she's on a one-way trip away from Earth, never to see another human being ever again. So the trick of the thought experiment is that Carruthers would say to you, Allie, yeah, absolutely, right? If she were on Earth and she were doing this, external evaluators, you might think, oh, Astrid, that's a slippery slope, right? If you're willing to throw cardboard darts at a cardboard cutout, the next step might be a cat or a kid, right? And so there's an external moral evaluation. This is the evaluation of Immanuel Kant and deontologists. Many Kantians and neo-Kantians think we have indirect obligations to animals, not because there's anything wrong with, say, darts at a cat, but instead because it's a slippery slope, right? Harming cats might lead us to harm human beings, and that's what really matters. But all of that comes from evaluation, right? You and I have to look at Astrid and say, now, wait a second. But there's no one looking at Astrid. So if you take that bit away, then the second half of your argument remains, right? It's cardboard. So there seems to be nothing wrong going on. But then Carruthers said, okay, cool, Allie, I heard what you said. So let's tweak the thought experiment now, right? Same Astrid, same trip away from Earth, never to see another human being again. She's going to get bored. She brings with her 3 darts and a cat. To alleviate her boredom, she throws the darts at the cat. Is Astrid doing anything wrong? And Allie, you would say,
yes.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Every student I've ever had in the last 20 years would say absolutely, right? Why? Because we have a really strong intuition that harming animals unnecessarily, especially pet animals, is morally wrong, right? There's all kinds of theories of this. There's all kinds of reasons we might feel this way, but basically we all share the intuition that's bad. Now, Carruthers says, look, Allie, we've set up for you 2 scenarios. One we think is not bad and one we think is bad. What's the relevant difference? So the only relevant difference is that there's a live cat involved and no live cat on the other. And so he says, look, if you think the live cat is wrong, it's got to be something about the cat, right? It can't be that you and I are evaluating Astrid because we're not there. And it can't be that there's anything else going on. It's only Astrid, spaceship, darts, cat, right? So the only relevant difference is living cat. And Carruthers says, look, if you buy this thought experiment, you're telling a story about the intrinsic value of the cat, the value the cat has in and of itself, not instrumental to us. If it were merely instrumental, we'd say, Astrid, you're getting less bored. Yeah, chuck those darts, right? But we don't think that. We think even if Astrid is like infinitely less bored, right? She's over the moon, get my pun, with less boredom. It's still bad because she's hitting the cat with darts. So it's supposed to be, this is a very strong intuition pump for us. We think of this thought experiment, we think, oh yeah, we don't throw darts at cats. But to understand why, given the constraints, the only explanation Carruthers wants to leave us with is this problem of intrinsic value, which is a big problem for ethicists. Like, where does that come from? Why does it matter? If there's no other evaluators, like, it's a thing. And Carruthers says, look, if your intuitions align with the story, then intrinsic value is a thing, and it does matter. And I love this thought experiment because there are very few more or less contemporary thought experiments that really are that strongly priming our intuitions, right? We look at, maybe some of us look at the trolley problem now in the context of the abortion debate, and we think, well, we know the story so well, and it's a trolley, it's a little outmoded, right? It's easy enough to tweak the constraints and not feel the intuition so strongly. But the cat case just seems to be right there, right? There's an obvious response. Whoa, this is bad. So there you've got an example intuition pump that's supposed to get us to reason about this really specific thing, intrinsic value of cats even. It's not behavioral, right? We're not talking about whether people would or wouldn't given a series of experimental constraints in the real world. This is abstract. It's not historical. We're not looking back into the past necessarily. We're looking at the moment right now. And it's constrained. It's abstract, right? There's no such trip, no such Astrid, no such scenario. So it seems like that model fits. Right. Yeah. So Sterling, you asked in the chat a minute ago, right? Do most thought experiments lean on consequentialism or utilitarianism? A lot of them do, sure, because utilitarianism is a big and prominent ethical theory, right? Evaluating consequences of our actions. But not all of them. A lot of thought experiments, Liar at the Door from Kant is another good one, which are trying to get at problems with deontological theories or virtue theories or pick an ethical theory. But they're all supposed
the
to
only way that I saw it. The only way that I saw it maybe connected to utilitarianism is in the notion of wasting human effort or not being productive, insofar as it's maybe not just about her alleviating boredom, but ought to be about our actions are constructive. And if she's conducting an action which may not affect anyone else, and it may not, sacrifice any intrinsic value, it may affect the intrinsic value of the individual throwing the darts, insofar as it's not a productive outlet. I don't know if that's reaching or not.
No, that's not reaching. And if I remember it correctly, there's no additional constraint. It's not like Carruthers said the only thing Astrid could do is throw the darts. So you're right to think maybe there's something she could have done to further the spaceship's sustainability or build her own cognitive capacity or something. It's just she should alleviate boredom.
Do you think it fundamentally changes the problem at all if instead of going from cardboard cat to real cat, we go maybe somewhere in between, like having cardboard picture of a human baby? Does that do anything to the problem?
Not well. We could talk that through. I would say not.
Or the cat's dead already. Or the cat's dead already.
Oh yeah, that's another interesting one. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think it got to the issue of sanctity and whether sanctity is a value that's held by the individual or inherently by society and judgment of others. You disconnected Astrid from everyone else. You said never going to see another human again, but there still could be a value of sanctity there, and so somehow throwing a dart at the picture of a human is degrading to self because it's destructive of the image of human or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think there's lots of ethical lenses that you can read thought experiments like this. So you could do the same thing, leaving the thought experiment as is, right? Are we able to say something about Astrid's character? If character is a non-relational capacity, you've got it or you don't, and other people might be able to see it, but it's not necessary for them to evaluate you. You might think just by Astrid being willing to throw the darts at the cat set aside, right, says something bad about Astrid as a person, like her character is flawed in some way. If you took virtue to be the sort of thing that's intrinsic to somebody. Yeah. And the virtue ethicist would think this, right? To run the theories really quickly, the consequentialist would say it's a silly thought experiment because you've got cat and a human, they're both capable of suffering. Is the cat suffering more than Astrid is getting pleasure? Well, it depends. And that calculus could play either way, so it's hard to say. But you could do the calculus and figure that out. The deontologist would say, Astrid, if she's alleviating her boredom, it's probably all right to throw darts at it. Well, it depends on the deontologist, but Kant would probably say, we have only indirect obligations to animals, and so there's no other person around, so Astrid, have at it. Oh yeah. Okay, good. So Sterling, there are other philosophers, I should be more careful, other moral philosophers like Bernard Williams, who develop theories of ethics in the contemporary landscape. Martha Nussbaum is another one of these, who sort of use thought experiments to critique or attack or defend positions in normative theory. So you say Bernard Williams criticizes utilitarianism based on thought experiments. So yeah, I think there's a lot of examples of these. And that would be a fun game to do too, to sort of track down through contemporary moral philosophers or moral ethicists, moral philosophers, their use of thought experiments, not just who designed them and who came up with them in their initial use, but how they're used or reused in contemporary philosophy or ethics. And this will be fun, Ali, for somebody like you too, to go to keep an eye out as you're reading in around business and sort of think, does anything like this show up, and what work is it doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like Sterling, that you're working on Bernard Williams in the chat. Yeah, there's some good stuff.
I'm kind of leaning in that direction too.
Well, I had not ever really considered any thought experiments that were not utilitarian. I mean, the trolley has something to, the greater good and everything.
Well, it doesn't. It wasn't intended to in the way that it was initially designed, right? Foote and Thompson were working out this distinction between killing and letting die as functionally deontological maxims, right? If you were just a utilitarian and you said 5 versus 1, you'd say, well, there you go, that's easy, right? You squish the 1. But Foote, the reason it's a problem for Foote and Thompson is because it's not just calculus, right? It's not just utilitarian reasoning going on in this debate. It's something much more fundamental, right? Much more sort of maxim-driven, deontological, something much more primal than mere calculus. And that's what, I mean, again, what drives the abortion debate. If you took it just to put it in really practical terms, if you took the mother and the infant or the fetus and you said mere calculus, you could tell an interesting story, and people have that ad nauseum at length at this point. Like, do you calculate the fetus's potential future? And you add in all the potential goods or sufferings it might have. How do you evaluate those? If the mother's really sick, does that matter? Because she's not going to have a set of goods, or she's going to end up in a lot of harm. Or if the mother's going to die, do you think, well, the fetus doesn't have any goods, and so you let the mother live, right? That's all utilitarian calculus in the abortion debate, but that's not all the reason.
So the trolley problem poses 2 different normative theories: consequentialism versus the innate value type.
Yeah, maybe one closing thing I might suggest is that I think a good thought experiment would let you evaluate it based on any number of different normative approaches, right? As the person pulling the lever, are you a good or bad person for doing it or not doing it? And how do you evaluate that? That's a virtues question. Is there a maxim that you have to follow such that you kill or let die, and one of those is preferable or better? That's a deontological question. Is it 5 people versus 1 people, like mass calculus, Hitler versus a bunch of saints or something over here? Like, is it an outcomes question? But the power of that thought experiment, I think a lot of them, is that you can reason through them from all of these various angles, using different normative tools, normative theories, and still get at the same sort of fundamental tension. And then that's where from there you build arguments. And that's what's so fun about thought experiments. And that's maybe, I don't know if there's strong parallel there to the scientific thought experiments. It seems like there are, right? You set these up, and then if you can articulate them more clearly from a quantum mechanical perspective than a Newtonian mechanical perspective, you've got a better outcome. And that's the approach you go with. Dr. Kubler, go ahead. Last thoughts.
Yeah, last one, because we're running out of time here. I just wondered if, regardless of what we think a thought experiment is, or how it works, or what its value is, do you think the subset of thought experiments that we have now is sufficiently complete to address questions like artificial intelligence or artificial life?
No, I think the power of part of the power of thought experiments is that they're situational, right? The trolley problem at that time, especially in the British tradition, everybody knew what a trolley was. They'd seen trolleys go down tracks. They knew what the levers did. They sort of had this embodied experience that connected them to the case. I think we're going to need new thought experiments. They might ask the same fundamental questions, but we're going to need new updates as we get situations. And I don't know where those are going to come from. It'll be interesting if they come, Ali, from the business world, or if they come from philosophy, or if they come from science again. I mean, I think anybody who's asking these sort of fundamental questions could design a really thoughtful thought experiment to get at something fundamental. And I'm excited about
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for being here. This was a lot of fun. I hope you all got something out of it. I'll get the video up, Ali, and others. It'll be up on our website in a couple of days. In the meantime, we've got one more session coming up next month where we're going to look at questions of disability. So this was a suggestion from a participant last year. So we'll listen to 2 podcasts and then think about disability and its connection to ethics through the lens of autonomy and justice and a bunch of other normative approaches. So I hope you'll join us, and I'll do a better job of sending out a reminder in our next session next month.
This was great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Beaver. Glad
Thanks,
to see all
everybody.
you guys.
See you soon.